Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a wonderful little book I just finished reading this morning, The Lord's Work and the Lord's Way and No Little People. This is written by Schaeffer. I'll say more about him in a moment, and is part of the Crossway Short Classics series. This has been coming out for a few years now. This book was published in 2022, this short classic edition. The material that it's working with is actually written in the 70s. But this is a great series. You'll probably see me review a few more of these. I've got a stack of these on my shelf. I've read a few, and I'm kind of taking it on myself to try and read through the rest, at least of the ones that I have. But the point of this series that Crossway is putting together is to take classic works from church history. Some of them were more recent, like this. This was written in the latter half of the 20th century. Others are from the 19th century, or perhaps even older beyond that. But trying to take works that have demonstrated their significance over time, that are powerful, but are also very concise. Sometimes they're editing works, but oftentimes they're just taking works that aren't that long, that maybe have existed as articles or little booklets or sermons, and just repackaging them in a beautiful, portable, affordable way. And so this is one of the books in that series. And it is a republishing of two really wonderful sermons that were preached by Schaeffer. So Schaeffer is a name that maybe a little less familiar to younger evangelicals today, but he was a very significant figure in the kind of second part of the 20th century. He was a Presbyterian pastor and missionary. So I've mentioned before in this channel, I'm a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which had connections with Schaeffer down through the years. But Schaeffer went on to become a missionary working in Switzerland. And he and his wife Edith established a really unique kind of study center and center of kind of communal Christian living called L'Abri. And people would come from all over the world to travel to stay with them, sometimes for a few nights, sometimes for weeks or months, to talk about and to understand the Christian faith. Sometimes these were Christians who wanted to grow in their understanding of the faith. Oftentimes, they were young people who were not Christians at all and were just trying to kind of find themselves in their identity. Kind of the heyday of Schaeffer's ministry was in the 60s and 70s. So you think about all the cultural turmoil, but also how so many young people, in some ways a lot like today, were feeling unmoored from belief and identity and faith, and they were just hungry. They weren't sure what they were looking for, but they were looking for something. Some were turning to kind of secular atheistic materialism. Others were turning to Eastern mysticism. But people were hungry, and the Schaeffers stood as a really powerful and effective witness to that generation. And Schaeffer became well known because not only of his kind of apologetics work, kind of interacting with people who are questioning and trying to understand the faith, but also as someone who was very much at the forefront of helping evangelicals more broadly to think about their faith, to be a thoughtful intellectual source. And he was famous for kind of popularizing a more intellectual stream and trying to bring together art and philosophy and history and theology, all these things, and to show how Christianity shaped and intersected with each of those things. And so he was also concerned with social issues. He was one of the first kind of evangelicals to really wave the flag politically and culturally on the absolute centrality of the pro-life position and addressing the claims of abortion. And so he's well known for all of those things. But what we have in this book is not his apologetics, it's not his cultural engagement, it's not his intellectual offerings. It's two sermons, The Lord's Work and the Lord's Way, and No Little People. So this book contains a brief foreword by Ray Ortland, a kind of introduction to the series that I was telling you about, and then just a page or two on who Schaeffer is. But the bulk of this book, it's about 100 pages, the bulk of this book are those two sermons that Schaeffer preached many, many years ago. I don't know the exact context in which he preached them, but they are really powerful sermons that are a good kind of summary of the heart of Schaeffer's work and ministry. And both of them are in some ways fleshing out his view of ministry, because while Schaeffer did become well known, eventually. He did not start off well known. And he was someone who was not a celebrity pastor, preacher, conference, circuit kind of person in his day. He was kind of an odd man. He often served in out-of-the-way places, rural Pennsylvania or the mountains of Switzerland, and it always stood a little bit outside the mainstream. And you see how he came to that from his understanding of the scriptures and the way that the Bible talks about the nature of ministry. And he begins to unpack that really in this first sermon, the Lord's work in the Lord's way. And what he talks about is the importance of not just doing what God has called us to do, like pursuing certain goals, but doing it according to the means that God has provided. In other words, God doesn't just tell us, hey, I want more churches, and then it's up to us to figure out how to do that, or to sort of force that outcome through our own effort or genius or marketing or whatever, which, those of you in America will know that's very much how we naturally think as a culture. But that God is actually saying, I want you to do my work, but in my way. I'm not just about the end, I'm about the means as well. And Schaeffer really puts his finger on the importance of that. He says that the real problem, the central problem, as he puts it, for the church today, is not liberalism or modernism or the old Roman Catholicism or the new Roman Catholicism or communism or any of these kind of things, these isms that people point to. He says that's not the central problem. What is the central problem? He says the real problem is this: the church of the Lord Jesus Christ, individually or corporately, tending to do the Lord's work in the power of the flesh rather than of the Spirit. The central problem is always in the midst of the people of God, not in the circumstances that surrounding them. That's a powerful quote. And I think he's exactly right to say that so much of what we do, and I think I'm convicted of this as a pastor who's full-time in ministry, but for us as churches as a whole, denominations, the natural tendency is to try to do things in our own power, with our own strength, using our own resources, leaning on our own advantages and schemes and agendas and all of those kinds of things. And Schaeffer just brings us back to the fact that God is the one who works through us, but God is the one who works, and we have to work leaning on His Spirit, doing it in His way. And that means that we follow the means that God has appointed. We work not for the praise of men, but for the praise of God. We're willing to serve in overlooked and out-of-the-way places. I'll talk more about that when I talk about the second sermon, and so many other things as well. And really what Schaeffer puts at the heartbeat of this, doing the Lord's work in the Lord's way, is an embrace of the humility which marked Christ, our Savior. So a very powerful sermon, very convicting. Again, if you are involved in ministry, full-time, part-time, if you're thinking about pursuing ministry in some capacity, this is a really important sermon to help you see the importance of not just the ends, but the means that God has appointed, and of the character and humility that He desires from that. And the second sermon, No Little People, No Little Places, really goes along very, very well with that first message, because what Schaeffer's doing here is maybe addressing the other impulse. So if the Lord's work in the Lord's way is addressing the impulse that we have to kind of pat ourselves in the back because our ministry is big and there's lots of people coming, or there's big numbers, churches are being planted or whatever, we kind of look at those results, we go, okay, yeah, we're doing good. And he says, well, maybe we're not, if we're not actually doing the Lord's work in the Lord's way. So there's kind of a corrective on that side. But then on the other side would be the person who is laboring and they're not seeing the kinds of fruits, or they're in a small out of the way kind of place, or they're not in a church or a denomination that the culture is listening to. They're not part of the movers and shakers. They feel neglected, or they just feel inadequate. How many of us were faced with a task, a ministry opportunity, and we just go, I can't do this. I don't have that gifting. And if you are involved in Christian ministry, you probably feel that way multiple times a week. I know I do, where there's a conversation that you have to have, or a situation to deal with, or a passage to preach on. You just go, how do I do this? I'm not equipped for this. I'm nothing. And Schaeffer begins this sermon in a really strange place. He says, he begins with the assertion that with God, there are no little people. and there are no little places. So he says that voice in the back of your head that says you're too small to matter, this isn't really significant, is not God's voice, because God not only can work through little people or can work through little places, he tends to do it. He likes it that way. This is one of the things I mentioned recently in my review of The Hobbit. Tolkien really got this, that the small things, the overlooked things, the Hobbit becomes the hero. That's not the way we tell the story normally. For us, it's the knight, it's the wizard, it's the grand kings. But for Tolkien, he goes, no, it's the Hobbit. It's the small, it's the overlooked, in the little place. And Tolkien is grabbing hold of something that God himself reveals in the scriptures, that it's the small things. God says in Malachi 1, when he's speaking to Israel, he said, I didn't pick you because you were the strongest. In fact, I picked you because you were the weakest, because you were the smallest. Paul talks about the same dynamic in 1 Corinthians, right? It's not the great, the wise, the powerful, the wealthy of the world. It's the foolish. It's the overlooked. That's who God chooses to work through. And Schaeffer is drawing on all of that. And he illustrates it in a wonderful way by saying that what has encouraged him in this is to think about Moses' rod. You think about that and you go, what is he saying? Well, he's pointing back, and he spends some time just trying to tracing this through Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy to show how when Moses was standing before God, he was a shepherd in Midian. God appears to him in the burning bush, and God gives him this amazing commission, this amazing task, and Moses goes, I can't do that. I'm not equipped for this. How could I possibly do this? And God points to the rod, the staff that he was holding as a shepherd. And he tells him to throw down the staff, and it turns into a snake, and then tells him to pick up the snake, and it turns back into the staff. And then you go through the story of Moses, and God uses that rod again and again to judge Egypt and to bring plagues upon them and to show God's power over them. Later, he uses it in the wilderness to provide for and heal and restore his people. Even after Moses dies, that rod is placed within the Ark of the Covenant, and it's something that is taken with God's people as a sign and symbol of his presence. And Schaeffer says there's nothing less impressive than a stick, than a rod, a staff. It's a walking stick, right? And yet, what's important is it became God's stick. It became God's rod. Therefore, it was powerful. Therefore, it could be used. Therefore, it could overthrow the most powerful king in the world, right? And he just kind of meditates on that as something to encourage us when we feel small and weak and insignificant. I just feel like a chunk of wood. I feel like a stick. And how am I supposed to address what's going on here? And yet the question is, am I God's, right? And so he has this this moment in the sermon where he says, the problem for each of us is applying this truth to ourselves. Is Francis Schaeffer the Francis Schaeffer of God? That's the question he asked. I wrote in the margins there, is Ben Franks the Ben Franks of God? And you can put your name in there. Is so-and-so the so-and-so of God? And then he talks about how if there's no little people, there's no little places either. How God delights to work in out-of-the-way, overlooked places. How God is different than us, right? That we tend to emphasize big, significant places, big, significant churches. In fact, we equate, as I just did there, big with significant. But he says, biblically speaking, that's not how it always goes, right? The big is sometimes not very important in the grand scheme of things and from an eternal perspective. But the small place might be where God works most. And that's so important and helpful, again, for the person who's laboring in a job that doesn't seem to have this huge impact, but you're faithful and God's called you to it. There's no little people, there's no little places. To the mother who's spending hours of her life, years of her life, bearing children, nurturing children, caring for their needs, endless demands. What's the point? There's no little people, there's no little places. For the pastor or the missionary who goes and does all this training and all this preparation, has all these dreams and plans, and yet they're placed in somewhere in ministry, and the church is small and it stays small, or it's in a little town, or the numbers go down instead of up, or you're laboring overseas and there's just not a lot of fruit, and you're struggling financially, and your family's feeling the tension, and you think, what's the point? There's no little people, there's no little places. And Schaeffer just does a wonderful job, practically and pastorally, of drawing us to the scriptures teaching on these things and laying it before us. So if you are involved in ministry, especially, and if you're a Christian, you should be involved in ministry in some sense, but if you're a full-time minister or church worker, missionary, I think you could read this book every year. It's very short. I read it in a couple, just with my devotions, read it over a couple of days. And these are powerful little sermons. Pastors, as you're working with young men who want to come into the ministry, or perhaps officer candidates, elders, or deacons, this is a great way of just sort of recalibrating us to the priorities of the Bible, helping to detox some of our American consumeristic business mentality from our mindset, and to bring us back to how God thinks about these things, that God wants us to do His work in His way, and that there are no little people and no little places. So this is Francis Schaeffer's little book, part of Crossway's short classic series. I would highly recommend it to you.